Hi, Vaughan. Welcome to 10 Minute Talks, where practitioners, scholars, and scholar practitioners from all around the world come together to share their stories. Wait a second. Let me tell you something. These are not just a conversation, they are a reflection on peace, humanity, and change. In just 10 minutes, sometimes a little more, we uncover the small act, big ideas, and human moments that shape our world. I'm your host, Harshadeva. Joining me today is Dr. Daniel B. Sarvastani, Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Arts, Communications, and Social Science at University Canada West. Dr. Daniel is an Indigenous rights specialist, researcher, and applied anthropologist whose work spans Latin America, West Asia, and North America. He has collaborated closely with the Indigenous and local communities across these regions, going deep insights into their cultures and ways of life. With a PhD in cultural anthropology from University of Kansas, his research bridges the cultural identity and indigenous rights, inspiring cross-cultural understanding and deep respect for diversity. Welcome, Daniel. Dr. Daniel, it's a great pleasure to have you here. So let's get started. You often talk about cross-cultural understanding in your teaching. What does actually looks like in practice for you? And why do you feel it's so important for students and really for societies today?
Right. Well, thank you first of all for having me in this space, and I really appreciate giving me this platform. Thank you, and thank you to your audience. Cross-cultural understanding or cross-cultural teaching or studies, it's hard to quantify. It's not something like mathematics or sciences. Again, I apologize for the ambulances in the back. Again, I live in a busy part, so incidentally, there seems to be like a fire next door. To me, cross-cultural understanding is more of a commitment. It's not something you go to a classroom to learn about culture, right? It's a commitment, it's a long-term commitment to relational accountability, and not to study others, but to learn with other people, maybe with other people who have a different perspective. I mean, cultures, if you can think, if you can understand, and culture is such a hard thing to define. A culture is something that's all around us. You see, it's not something that necessarily we can point to and say this is culture. So, it's sometimes difficult to convey how profound culture is to human beings, and human beings actually see the world through cultural means. We live, everything around us is essentially cultural. So, to us, when we teach about cross-cultural studies or cross-cultural cross-cultural understanding, is really about being able to understand others, not necessarily to learn about them, but to try to relate to them, to relate to other people from different perspective. Because culture, we are all one human being, we are all one race, and what really makes us different is our cultural perspective, and that's beautiful. And from anthropological perspective, culture is necessary. In practice, how do we do cross-cultural understanding? Well, in practice, for example, to me, a good cross-cultural practice would be to do things like land-based learning, to invite elders to create bridges where, for example, students or learners can actually have a first-hand experience of another culture and actually engage with the communities, with the people of the land, engage with elders. And and if you might be familiar with this concept called land-based learning, which we use with the First Nations, for example, many First Nation cultures, learning comes from the land itself. Culture emanates from the land itself. To be able to spend time in the land, to be able to develop relationship with elders, with the people of the community, with that land itself, well, that's a cross-cultural understanding. So it's not really about learning about others, right? But it's about developing relationality, and to really experience culture. Culture is not something that you can just memorize, right? It's something you really have to experience on the ground, on the grassroots with the community. So for me, a good cross-cultural or multicultural understanding or perspective really involves that experiential based learning that that we try to sponsor or foster in our classrooms.
Right, right. So in anthropology, in a way, it invite us to see the world through different lenses, different realities, and different way of knowing. For your point of view, what can this education help people not just to understand those differences, but actually learn?
First of all, you got to understand anthropology itself. You know, at least anthropology, the way it was developed here in, let's say, Western Europe and North America, well, it has deeply colonial roots. You see, anthropology, unfortunately, anthropologists in the past were part of a colonial project. In many respects, they acted as colonial agents. And unfortunately, anthropology as a discipline, and I'm not saying anthropology is necessarily a European or Western thing, but as it was developed in the West, has had a dark history, especially when it comes to the relationship between colonial states and indigenous populations, right? Really, when you look at anthropology, how anthropology evolved from what we call armchair anthropologists, whereby originally, as Western European colonial power expanded throughout Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they came to encounter cultures and peoples who were vastly different than, say, their Western Christian cultural norm. So they started developing certain frameworks, which became basically foundations of Western anthropological schools, right, to try to understand others. But of course, these understandings were framed from a very colonial perspective. So obviously there were a lot of racism, a lot of what we call othering, right, and a lot of essentialization of people who are non-Europeans. However, over the time, especially we have here, for example, here in the Americas, Frantz Fanon, Frank Boas, pardon me, the founder of the American School of Anthropology, right? We have started to move away from that colonial past. And today, anthropology stands as a study to try to foster understanding between cultural differences. I'd like to think that over the years we've learned from those mistakes that we have done. But more and more with new methods that we have developed, we can understand that this notion we have undermined, that we have debunked, for example, this notion of race. We know through biological anthropology and detailed study of genomes and human genetics that we are 99.99% similar. In fact, human beings are among the most homogeneous species on our planet. So it's very hard to justify, with modern access to science, biology, to justify racist ideology, to suggest that we are inherently as two different species or two different races. Well, that doesn't fly anymore because we have access to modern biology, modern genetic studies. What does make a difference is our cultural differences. But that's not to be feared, right? Because actually, anthropology also teaches us, and again, I use the term here, field work, right? In anthropology, we rely on field work, actually experiencing other cultures in the field itself, right? Through extensive field work, we can understand that a lot of us actually have very similar human urges, except they are expressed differently based on our environment, mostly the environment and the social ecosystems that we live in. That's what makes us different. And those cultures have grown in areas that have helped them survive in those particular regions. So every culture is in a way appropriate for the community, for the people within their respective ecosystem, social, environmental ecosystem. And the more we can immerse ourselves within other cultures, the more understanding we could have about what it means to put ourselves in the shoes of another person, to experience a culture from another perspective, rather than just judging other people from our perspective. So I believe that the anthropological method, right, to help us experience culture from another perspective, really can help us to try to step away from our ethnocentric ideologies, or what you call racial ideologies, bias ideologies, that we often use to justify our oppression of other people, other cultures who might be different than us.
All right. Finally, Dr. Daniel. So, with everything happening around us, all the noise, change, and challenges in the world, what was a small thing you do each day to keep you grounded? Something that helps you to stay hopeful and connected.
Absolutely. Well, the world is really rapidly changing. I mean, we live in an extremely fast-paced world. And I suppose every one of us have different ways of remaining grounded. For me personally, again, this comes from a very deeply subjective area. Um, uh, I tend to start every day with prayer. I wake up in the morning, I do a prayer, and what prayer does, especially in the morning, and everybody could be different, right? Everybody have a different form of prayer. I believe that is something that's very human. In fact, when we study many cultures, there are different form of prayers, right? Because it actually helps us, right? It helps us ground us. And so you touch on a key topic here. Every morning I start with a prayer, and this prayer, to the great creator, Allah, God, whatnot. But it also helps me to be grateful of every day, everything that I have, and for the small things that you might experience every morning. So for me, waking up with gratitude, acknowledging the land that I'm on, acknowledging the fact that I'm healthy, just being grateful for every single breath that I'm taking. It's in a way, it's a form of meditation. So that really helps me ground myself every day. Um, and then also in my profession, right? In my profession, learning with my students, learning, you talked about cross-cultural understanding, fostering cross-cultural understanding itself, for me, is extremely rewarding. It helps me to humanize. It helps me to, first of all, understand my own biases, my own judgments, and try to humanize things or cultures that might otherwise seem very different than me. This act itself, for me, it gives me a lot of peace and joy, and this is why I do it. And the fact that I'm able to spend time with indigenous First Nation communities or cultures that are very different than me, and actually sit down with people from across different perspectives in meditation, in prayer, in song, in ceremony. Well, this teaches me that there are multiple ways of being, multiple ways of knowing, right? This in itself is deeply philosophical and gives me great meaning. And to me, this meaning making combined by, my meditation practice, my prayer practice really helps ground me. And I think, it helps me have a sort of peace, right? In the midst of all the, you might say, chaos around us.
Dr. Daniel, thank you so much for sharing your insights and time with us today. It has been such an inspiring conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as we say in yoga, the light within me honors the light within you.